Originality is what most people live for. It's the birth of a creative idea for a new story nobody has even heard of before in most cases unless you do adaptations of various works. And it's apparently something that everyone wants to clamor for these days when they look back to their youth and see a spur of films that were uniquely different from each other. Or in the case of the Disney of old, from the 1930s to the 2000s to some extent, they were nothing but originals. I mean, again, on the other hand, you could also say they could fall under the category of adaptation since they were exactly that of 100-year-old stories, but it was just one film after another for the most part of those adaptations, with sequels only too far and too few in between. But now in the 21st century, they and many other studios actually have switched to focus on making something far more profitable, something far more easier in terms of sequels, remakes, and other spin-offs. Where as a company grows, so does its portfolio of familiarity, with franchises galore when it came to stuff like Marvel or Star Wars, and just their own films they made a decade ago alongside many others when it came time to do just that and give to the fans what they wanted. Where today, it just feels like not too many people even watch original animated films anymore, or just originals in general, and are far more interested in sequels when you take a look at the numbers. You just look at last year alone and you remember that Disney scored with both Inside Out 2 and Moana 2 as the highest grossing animated films of that year, and for its time, Inside Out 2 being the highest grossing animated film of all time, until that was also later beaten by Ne Zha 2, which also happens to be an animated sequel if you couldn't tell to a beloved Chinese franchise by the looks of it. That no matter what, the whole entire world just takes a great big liking to these sequels, to spend more time with characters they know rather than adding a new adventure every other year. And this video is inspired by that great question many people have seemed to be confused by, and how by recent times the only big hitters just seem to be those sequels and remakes, with DreamWorks' How to Train Your Dragon becoming the great start for them to dip their toes into this genre, as I have recently mentioned, not long after Disney's own Lilo & Stitch remake. But despite this, I by no means share the opinion that having original films don't work anymore, but expressing a huge truth when it comes to them in theaters, where most people are just looking for something familiar but also very good in what it does. That nobody is willing to take on much risk if a project doesn't feel that interesting or appealing to a wider demographic. That moreover instead, this video is actually a one to be advocating for more original projects to appear, but the statement of the truth that sequels are now necessary for all of them to even float on by. Because there's actually been some cases outside what I've talked about where original films have done successful at the box office, but the stronger case actually comes in the form of those extensions they have. But nevertheless, it's still something that's sad to talk about because not all of them really have the quality to do so, especially by Disney when you remember their initial sequel reputation era was built by this quote that you can't top pigs with pigs, where they can do well financially, but not enough critically. It's somewhat too similar for DreamWorks when you take a look at their original films and sequels, but how some are still considered to be greater than their predecessors as something Disney couldn't do review-wise, even though, again, most of them still remain to be inconsistent. And their sequel films do better than their originals even nowadays, where technically their own original films don't even make as much money as you think. Not on the level that they bomb, some of them did of course, but they have lower budgets and kind of a less Disney-wide appeal if you know that general box office earnings. Hence why you see both Universal own DreamWorks and Illumination, with Illumination being their more profitable buddy to make franchises out of Minions and another Despicable Me film every few years at this point it seems. But the bigger picture beyond this, and the real point of talking about everything, has to do with the mixed feelings I have about films like Elio as a Pixar film, where keep in mind this video came out before that movie release, but how I just feel like it's not going to come off as strong with its story or setting, not appealing for that wider audience like it used to be, where it feels like something done or better in a work 20 years prior. I still don't doubt, like all Pixar films, that this one is going to be a decent success that won't be too hard to simply like all of their films have done in the past, giving me no reason to actually hate their collection unlike someone else, but I just think the taste is in for something else, where it can be a moderate success like how Elemental ran away with those legs, where I do admit I did prop up that film more than it should be for the time because it did succeed when others thought it would fail. Where on the other hand, it just shows a case where originals actually do work despite their openings, but we as a collective audience just tend to see one thing now and stick with it. Where that feeling transcribes to all the other originals that we're talking about right right now and why people are less interested. The major reason that involves that we are being pushed as an audience to see the same things over and over, and we are more willing to accept that in the public eye. Remember, most of Pixar's sequels outside of Toy Story 2 and Cars 2 actually have grossed over $1 billion each, meaning they are the far most popular movies of this entire genre, which can also be the same said for modern Disney with Frozen 2 and Moana 2, that also grossed over $1 billion each, which to be fair is all built on the reputation they had in the early 2000s, before films really actually made billions of dollars on the regular with Monsters, Nemo, Incredibles, and so on, that were just really huge hits for its time. That beyond Toy Story 2, they were just on the similar path to Disney's heyday in terms of a growing studio just simply producing movies to a wider range of topics, but how nowadays, all of the studios have now shifted gradually to include more sequels in the works. I mean, why would you think otherwise when Disney's 2025 film happens to be Zootopia 2, and the year end for them consists of Avatar's third film? Because you know for a fact that all of them will be clearly profitable ideas and audiences will be more than willing to give their time to see it because of the crews involved and the reputation it's already gotten. People like Zootopia, people like Avatar, people like all the franchises that have given them a reason to get a good time. But this fact all relates to COVID itself and what happened to all of us that changed our own habits. I mean, I'm not going to discuss anything more than that in terms of how we personally felt when 2020 actually ruined our lives, but how it also ruined how films were going to be treated. Yes, we know the year before all of that happened, Disney did struck gold with all of their remakes and sequels hitting over billions upon billions, but how they also tried from 2020 to 2022 in the COVID time in terms of originals again. Yet how that was exactly the wrong time to do so, and people thought better to watch what they did to release on Disney+, which happens to be another topic to be discussed on its own 6 years later after its release. That this era was the turning point to how people would see their films in some way, and of course other studios in their own platforms. Where you think of how 2021, Encanto still didn't do too well in theaters because COVID was still a major factor, but actually had succeeded on Disney Plus with its popular soundtrack, and Raya the Same Earlier was just released on Disney Plus because it was still under COVID, just like most of Pixar's own originals in Soul, Luca, and Turning Red in 2022, where they never gave it the benefit to release and struck disaster with Lightyear to return. Like everything they have produced here, besides Lightyear, they were still very good films that just never saw the light of theatrical day, and it only made it worse when you got back to that same early Elemental problem where we find ourselves today in the stigma of how I think their next films are going to go. That indeed, after this, of what would be expected, you would still go back to your produced works of sequels like Inside Out 2 that would prove to be the big jumpstart it really needed of a film that became both critically and financially successful. People came back to it because they heard it was good and expected it back from the original film itself and what they remember going into all of these other sequels Pixar's made that were huge hits, that still struck a chord because both the parents and the kids had a good time based on their memories. Hence why we go back to making other films like Incredibles 3, Toy Story 5, and so much more because it's already proven itself to do the job. Where it's not the fact that originals fail, they don't, but they just aren't the majority interest when it comes to the time that films can make way more money than they used to, barring inflation of course. And we should still also commend them for even doing and attempting to make originals despite how some aren't that good, because they could just simply toss those ideas out the window forever and just rely on one single property and never see the light of day of any original if the money was there, where it's just a factor of how they need them still if they want more ideas or money out of them, since it all starts with having something that can become a tangible property if the audience wants that in the first place. And even so, that only proves how much attention it could have if they really make some extension to it, creating a new generation to look back on the original work and watch what once was if the time was fit to it. I mean, that is one positive, but it still doesn't change the outcome of the recent originals that have failed or haven't made as much money, or how others just really don't care. It never changes the fact that people aren't just gonna watch it. They simply just do not care enough to give a damn to their time, where if its initial reactions aren't that good for the most part, there is no incentive for others to really watch it like Wish or Strange World. That you just can't go present society with a simple idea anymore. You have to work for it. Work for your time. That has also been the case for bigger properties like Marvel or Star Wars, ironically enough, because people just cannot take what they do all the time anymore. It's weird even to say that since they're all interconnected films, unlike the topic of this video, but just the same stigma or feeling of how people just spend their time with this wobbly nature of going to the theaters anymore. The future of how it's going to even survive or even be watched at all. And it's just never going to stop because they don't want it to stop. They don't want to stop making these sequels and then another one on top of the other one they just did, or remake that one and encourage the other company to do just the same because they planned more with it and then do a sequel based on that same film yet again. That's a problem that only persists as long as they let it be, where the only solution is to do more of the other thing if people don't agree. That the real reason originals don't really work is because they just don't want them to work, both audience and company together, where we have trained ourselves well to expect the expected, where the solution is to simply retrain people on watching that instead, or even make an actual effort to make it good. That it's not truly dead in people wanting to see it, but certainly in a habit needing to be revived, repeating the cycle again and adding on to the same thing in its legacy or whatnot that you would expect. And frankly, I don't expect that system to really change, and can only really hope for the best of these future films, adding impactful characters and also originals alongside familiar faces, and the persistence to continue to make these films despite the amount of money they make. I'm all done. Goodbye.